My job as an analyst is to pick up on the cues. And there were several cues that I picked up on at lunch that I hope you caught too. One of the cues that I got in lunch was something that I presented last year. Last year, in my presentation, I talked about pricing as kind of the major dominant theme that was impacting the market. And I said that we would have to climb the wall of worry of pricing. Pricing was almost an afterthought during the lunch meeting. Yes, it's a big issue. Yes, there may be very big prices. What's the value of a curative therapy? And even Sovaldi was mentioned as a passing thought, where last year Sovaldi was the centerpiece of the pricing argument. So I don't think pricing is the wall of worry anymore. I think one of the other points that I picked up on luncheon, which is very relevant to this panel, is other avenues for financing. Where is the IPO window? Where is the secondary market window? And one of the things that became very clear to me is that there may be some very significant BD deals. When we look at kind of the funding behind a Bluebird, a Kite, a Juno, or a Novartis very active in the space, or any of the other companies represented here, J&J, Sanofi and Serono, clearly these are companies that have very strong balance sheets, and you're gonna see funding and partnerships. That's good for the companies. It's bad for me, bad for Wall Street, but eventually Wall Street always wins, because eventually you will always come back to the market. We do think the market windows are gonna open. So with that topic, my job today is to make this panel work. And we have a very exciting group of panelists. Jeff Till of Serono, and one of the things that I discovered about Jeff is that he's been involved with Opexa, and we cover Opexa. Well, Opexa currently has a market cap of about $12 million, and they're working on a transformative therapy for relapsing remitting MS. So, there are some things here that I really want to talk to you about, and I know there's a limit to how much you can say. Mark Zimmerman, and Mark and I had a very exciting conversation. I kind of envied you because there was a point in my life where I left a parent to go to a venture, only I didn't get a check from the parent. Mark left J&J and was spun out into a cell therapy venture, but he's still being sponsored very much by J&J, and I think you were explaining that your role in that venture is really BD and to drive that venture to success. So you're kind of semi-pregnant, but you're not completely. And Dr. Cheng, we were talking about Sanofi and your experience in cell therapy. And what was fascinating for me is going back to the Genzyme days and going back to Corticell and Macy and kind of where those therapies are. And what was interesting to me was you didn't really want to talk about any of that. We were already talking about CAR T and gene therapy, and look at how the title of this very conference has changed. This conference for the last 3 years was about cell therapy and regenerative medicine, and it seems to be transforming into gene therapy, and I think that our conversation really reflects that. And Oz, I'm very excited to talk to you. Obviously, Novartis is kind of the leader in CAR T. We hear about Bluebird, Kite, and Juno because they're quantifiable. I can look at Bluebird. I can understand their pipeline. I can't look at Novartis, right? It's so big. There's so much going on. So if you can help us understand, and you talked a lot about this morning, and in our conversation, we talked about the resources that Novartis brings to a parent. So with that said, I want to turn this over to the panel, and we've organized kind of a structure to this panel. We're going to start with Jeff. We're going to go right across and end up with Oz on the end. And I've asked each of the panelists to share with us 4 to 5 minutes on their background and how they came to be in this position where they're involved in BD and partnering. And I don't want to just make it cell therapy, but clearly there's cell therapy, and that can mean a lot of things. It can mean gene therapy, CAR T. It can also mean regenerative medicine, diabetes. And so I know there's some interesting parts to that story. So with that, let me turn it over to Jeff.
Yeah, thank you. So a little bit of my background really came from a background in small molecule drug discovery, kinases and kinase inhibitors. That was back in the heyday of kinase inhibitors and the time of Gleevec. So I moved from drug discovery into a services business management over at Millipore. And there was drug discovery services business. And one of the things we were looking for was something innovative, something new, beyond kinase profiling, something that would really bring value to customers at the time. And one of the areas that we thought we could make a win in was in providing more predictive cellular models. And that brought me to, well, what's going on with stem cells? And again, this was back in, I think, 2009 or so, where there was a lot of hype about stem cells and a lot of promise and potential around stem cells. And there we really started a collaboration to develop manufacturing systems for cells, both for research products and ultimately down the road as cell therapies. Well, that kind of background became valuable in my position at Serono, which I started in 2012. And in 2012, it was really focusing on external innovation opportunities to license in new technologies, new assets to support neurology, immunology, and oncology, franchises. And an opportunity came up with a company called Opexa. Opexa has developed a product called T-Selma. It's an autologous T-cell-based therapy. And this product was intriguing to me because I asked the question, well, how are we going to manufacture this product? How are we really going to bring it to market? And there hadn't been a lot of discussion about that. And that surprised me because really what I'd learned in the past in cell therapy and providing cells for customers was it's not an easy thing. Manufacturing these cells in bulk quantities and reproducibly, it's a very, very challenging manufacturing paradigm. So that kind of brought some visibility to that program, and along the way, we started talking about CAR T to complement our immuno-oncology space. And CAR T, we entered into a collaboration with Intrexon Corporation. That was announced last year, and that collaboration really provides us with the toolbox of Intrexon, which is really a DNA technology toolbox, and the expertise of Zyopharm. Zyopharm is another company, so it's really a three-way agreement. Zyopharm is working very closely with MD Anderson, so that provides us, again, I think this was mentioned this morning, the importance of connecting with academic centers who have experience and expertise in this area. MD Anderson was that company for us. So really that brought me to an opportunity to really manage this program. And what's different from a lot of our other partnerships is that our core focus in the company is around antibody therapeutics, small molecules, and the marriage between them, antibody-drug conjugates. Cell therapy wasn't in our remit, and Opexa is a licensing deal. Intrexon is beyond a licensing deal. That is an R&D collaboration or partnership, but it's all external. So I think other companies are doing something very similar where they're managing a complete R&D program externally. And that's what this partnership is really focused on.
So Jeff, in your role when you interact with, say, an Intrexon or an Opexa, but I'm going to focus on Intrexon, is your job to act as the liaison to kind of oversee the partnership? Are you utilizing their tools? Are people coming to you from inside Serono saying, can you solve this with Intrexon?
Not so much. We have a very defined research program with Intrexon. We nominate targets and we develop those targets. It's picking researchers within the R&D group to act on a virtual R&D team to direct that program. Again, there's no wet lab R&D actually in the company. And I bring that knowledge, what's going on to Intrexon, back into the company and explain it. And that's really one of the biggest challenges is explaining what we're doing there and how different it is from traditional drug discovery.
I can only imagine. We'll come back to that. Let's transition to Mark. Let's talk a little bit about J&J. You've also had kind of you're certainly in an interesting experience. Help me understand kind of your background and at J&J, and then the decision and the incubation to kind of become part of this spun out venture.
Sure. So I'm Mark Zimmerman. I have a Ph.D. in biomedical engineering, and I actually spent 20 years doing orthopedic research. I joined J&J in 1997 and was involved in tissue engineering projects around cartilage and bone and knew some of the Genzyme products well. But some of the projects I got involved with were around cardiovascular, wound healing, and one crazy little project was with Edmonton, trying to develop scaffolds for islets. And after the Edmonton protocol was published in 2000, there was a decision in J&J to develop a startup team, an incubator, focused on developing a cell therapy for diabetes. So we started as an incubator, we started in LifeScan. There's a long story about how we moved around in J&J, but the short story was Dave Holvek, who was the ex-CEO of Centocor, had a vision of startups in a big pharma. So we became an internal venture. We were managed with a management board, scientific boards, and we had a single mission and vision, which was to develop a cell therapy for diabetes. We spent about 4 years working on different adult cell therapies. At this time point, there were lots of ways to cure diabetic rodents with adult cells. We either couldn't reproduce a lot of that, or it just wasn't very robust in our hands, given our experience. And then that led to an investment in Novacell at the time. And ramping forward, we transitioned into the embryonic stem cell space. They were in the embryonic stem cell space. And there were a number of investments made by our JJ Development Corps in the course of this. And there were multiple times where we tried to come up with we had an internal program, and we were firewalled off from the external investment. And it just made sense at some point to try to combine the entities. So we entered into discussions last fall, and then just a month ago we announced essentially what we're doing is a little bit, it's very different, very innovative given our innovation strategy. We're taking our assets in Beta Logics, which is a single group focused on that mission. We're spinning them into ViaCyte. Novacell has since become ViaCyte. So all of our technologies, which includes cell differentiation processes, process development, manufacturing, device work, all that gets transferred in. All the intellectual property will now be fused, and so ViaCyte has a very robust IP portfolio. And talent. 5 of the folks from my organization will be seconded, will be dedicated for a 2-year window to transfer in all that technology and facilitate, improve the probability of success and facilitate success for a diabetes cell therapy product.
And I assume that those people, and maybe yourself, at the end of 2 years have the option of either going with the venture or returning back to the parent?
That's exactly right. You know, if there's opportunities in the enterprise, then we can come back into the enterprise. Or if we hope ViaCyte, we're very successful, and there may be opportunities there for us.
Okay, well, I have a lot of questions, you know, particularly when we talk about cell therapy and diabetes, and also on exactly what your role is in the new venture, but we'll come back to it.
Sure.
So, Dr. Cheng, thank you so much for being with us. Help me understand a little bit about your journey to the gene therapy and CAR T space, going back to Genzyme, which was really one of the early adopters of cell therapy, but since the Sanofi acquisition has divested of the traditional regen space. So where are they today, and what's your role to make that happen? And you can, and I understand we're kind of moving up now to more of a big pharma kind of view of the cell therapy space.
Sure. So I've been with Genzyme since 1989. I was actually part of a smaller company that was acquired by Genzyme. And as many of you probably aware, Genzyme was a pioneer, not only in the development of therapies for orphan or rare diseases, but also one of the first companies that was very keen to deploy new and emerging technology. So as you mentioned, we were one of the first companies that actually marketed a cell-based therapy in the form of CAR-T-cell, Apicel, and AC. As well as gene therapeutics. And you're probably aware that we actually had a co-development program with a company called Ionis today to develop an oligonucleotide-based therapy for a rare genetic disease, in this case, familial hypercholesterolemia. So Genzyme was acquired by Sanofi about 4 years ago, and for strategic reasons, they elected not to continue to invest in the cell-based programs that we had developed at Genzyme. But we still continue to invest in the context of gene-modified cells to some extent. But the focus for us the last several years has been to focus on the development of what we commonly refer to as in vivo gene therapy using viral-based vectors that you're probably very familiar with. So that's the history. So I've been working in gene therapy for over 25 years, and I've had the privilege of helping to enable some of the technology development, both viral and non-viral based, as well as applying these technologies to a variety of disease indications, but primarily in the context of rare diseases. So we were one of the first companies that actually entered into a clinical study with gene therapy for cystic fibrosis. But our current focus now is, as you heard from various speakers this morning, is centered around inherited neurodegenerative diseases as well as inherited ocular diseases, because we feel that the technologies that we have in hand today represent ones that are sufficiently mature for use in these indications. My current role is the Global Head of Research for Rare Diseases as well as Gene Therapy. And as part of that charter is obviously to begin to not only develop the pipeline internally, but also to complement that from the external innovation that we also heard about this morning. And it really makes sense if you think about it. And also, although I work for a very large company that has a very generous R&D budget that was reported in 2015 to be around $4 to $5 billion, it's dwarf if you consider the totality of the investment that's made by the government, by the private and public sectors. So it absolutely makes sense that as part of my role that we constantly look at the external space and to identify assets that we either bring in through collaboration, partnerships, or acquisitions. I also make the point that if we really care, what I mean by that is if we really care about developing therapies for patients, I think the way to do this is to cultivate a network of partnerships. Because I don't think any single entity today, particularly as the technology is evolving, really has everything by themselves to do this efficiently and well. So there's obviously need to understand the biology across in the case of rare disease, 7,000 of them, so no entity actually knows many of them in detail. We need access to knowledge of vectorology, IP, and I think one of the things we're going to talk about is manufacturing as well, which is a limiting aspect of the in vivo gene therapy field anyway. So that's really where I do what I do. I build the pipeline for our organization.
I think it's very interesting, and a lot of thoughts come into my head when I hear you speak, and it's just partly the journey that Genzyme went on, because I think Macy and Corticell were innovative products, but they were very incremental to the disease. They were very difficult to manufacture, and they never produced great profitability for the parent. And so that kind of, to me, explains a little bit of their fate, and it's very consistent with what we heard this morning, which is, you know, this concept of transformative, right? And so they just were not transformative. And then I look at Genzyme's focus in niche orphan diseases that often have a genetic basis for them, and I could see where it lends itself to go back where we are. Fast forward to 2016, where we have these tools in CAR T and gene therapy, and it makes a lot of sense to me that that's where the focus would shift. And you know, I think there are some interesting questions about how you actually make that happen, and we'll come back to that in terms of manufacturing. And then on the end, we have Oz. We talked a little bit about Novartis, and I loved our conversation because we talked about the fact that, you know, I said, where is Novartis going to get the next molecule or the next target? What does Novartis bring to the equation? And, you know, you really helped me understand that Novartis really brings to a partner manufacturing expertise, regulatory expertise, kind of the ability to understand the entire Gantt chart and the life cycle and the required investment. But help me understand, when you know you're at work every day, what are you looking at? You're looking at internal projects, you're looking at external projects. You know, how do you go about your role in Novartis? And thank you.
Thanks for the question, Jason. So for a disclaimer, I have no formal training in cell and gene therapies, so I make that disclaimer up front. My background is I'm an OBGYN by training in the UK. My first experience of cell therapies was as an undergrad working on fetal neural tissue transplantation, looking for cures for Parkinson's disease back in the 80s. That's the last time I really touched cells. So make that disclaimer. And then I have been in the industry 16 years. I had the privilege of working in big pharma. Started off working in Warner Lambert Park Davis, which became Pfizer. I had the privilege of working in J&J for a good few years. Spent time in then biotech, in orphan indications, was a startup entrepreneur in 2008. 2008 was a really bad year to be a startup CEO. And then I ended up at Novartis, where I've had the distinct privilege of working as a leader in regulatory affairs, being a chief medical officer, head of development for the US, ran global medical, and then I had the distinct pleasure to work in cell and gene therapies. And so when I start to connect the dots, it's I don't really have cell and gene capabilities, but hopefully I bring some other skill sets to the party. And Novartis, you're right, has this sort of ability to look at ecosystems. It can look at business quite dispassionately and take a step back. We're a company that has a setup, as many of you know, businesses we've entered, businesses we've exited. We've been in consumer health, been in animal health, so we We've had a foray with a number of businesses over the years, but our core value proposition right now is that we have a very strong pharma general medicines business. We have an oncology business. We have a generics, biosimilars, premium business in terms of Sandoz. We have Alcon in surgical eye care. And then we're very unique in that for a large organization, we have a very separate research entity, Novartis Institute of Biomedical Research, which is very scientifically agnostic. It does not come under any commercial influence. It allows science to flourish and the ability to try and de-risk and look at many, many different spaces. So that's what Novartis brings in terms of capabilities to look at things holistically and globally as well, like many of the other larger players. So as I mentioned to some of you this morning, who unfortunately have to listen to me again twice now today, this morning the catalyst for doing what we're doing in cell and gene therapies really happened over 10 years. We were actively involved in programs in human stem cell expansion, particularly around sickle cell disease and thalassemia. We were also very interested in the transplant business, looking at things like graft versus host disease and how can you prolong the life of a kidney, for example, and eliminate immunosuppression and provide a chimeric immune system, for example. It's one of the programs that we have as well in-house now that is now phase 3 ready. But the real catalyst for my business being created was the fact that we realized that this is such a unique and special space that trying to make this work in the traditional small molecule or biologic way wasn't going to work, which is why we took a very bold move for a company like Novartis, which was to move everything from the different functional components, clinical, regulatory, finance, IT, CMC, TRD, quality, and put this into one integrated unit. And we've grown pretty quickly. We're an organization of 450 colleagues dedicated to cell and gene therapies, of which, to be very candid, 85 to 90% of our efforts are on CAR-T therapies, because that's the most mature offering we have, and we're very excited about hopefully being one of the first players to bring this to reality for patients. And over the 2.5 years, what I've really learned about this space is that you have to think very differently from a development perspective. You have to think incredibly differently from a business commercial perspective, because you're creating an ecosystem that is really a service business model, not a traditional pharma sales model. In fact, frankly, you may not even need the traditional sales setup for what we're all trying to do. So if I caveat that and then to look at your question in terms of how we approach this, we're pretty agnostic, as long as there isn't an obvious conflict of interest of a space we're in. So for example, if folks were to come up to me and say, partner with us on a new CAR-T, it's not going to happen, frankly, because we have so much tied up with UPenn and lack of freedom to operate in a good way, because we own that space with Penn in terms of the portfolio we have. But clearly, if there are other T-cell receptor technology, other cell therapies, clearly we're agnostic to looking at that. We have some programs in the ophtha space as well in research. We're doing programs in sensory neural hearing loss with gene therapies. So we're agnostic to certain areas of gene therapies. But again, what we have learned and what we're looking for in companies and partners of the future is clearly science sells and data helps. Human data really, really helps in this space. I think my colleagues would agree that preclinical models are just not predictive of outcome and response as they are in small molecules and biologics. So human data helps. Having companies that have really thought through GMP and quality thinking up front is really an important lens that I and colleagues in Novartis put when we're assessing opportunities from a business perspective. IP is incredibly important, and this is a space that we have a lot of challenges in IP. I think a lot of companies have done a great job, and as you've seen, there's a lot of exchange of IP now with appropriate collaborations, but that's something that we look at very, very closely in this space. That's a new and hot space. And I think the other piece, and I would not underestimate this, is talent and capabilities. The talent to do what we do in cell and gene therapies is extremely precious. This is still a young field in many ways. While it's been in development over 30 years, if you listen to Michelle this morning, as he talked about the CART story, there's a war for talent here as well. So we're looking at companies as well to see, do these guys really have the pedigree? Do they really know what they're doing from a technical perspective as well? And is this a group we're really going to be able to have a chemistry with and work together? So I hope I've given you some perspectives on the kind of things we look at.
That's very helpful. And interestingly enough, while you were talking, one of my slides popped up, and the slide is the awareness curve. And I've seen this curve. It was actually mentioned this morning We saw it with monoclonal antibodies, and it got very exciting. And then we saw it with the sequencing of the human genome. And I remember Human Genome Science and Celera had gone from $5 stocks to $140 a share, only to return back to $5, and then kind of morph into something else. We've seen that with gene therapy. I mean, we saw astronomical valuation spike this summer. We've seen gene therapy kind of crash. Not really, not at the low, but we've seen these just tremendous peak and now this valley. So my question to each of you is, given what you're working on now, where are we on the awareness curve? And why don't we work our way back from Oz back to me?
So I think on the awareness curve, if I just turn around and look at this, I think we are, honestly, I think we've bottomed out. We've gone through the rocky patch, and we're now getting a realization that, look, there are some good things that will be happening in this sector in the next few years, and I think sooner rather than later. I think immuno-onco and CAR therapies in oncology, huge area of unmet need, will be a beachhead, and I think that will set a framework in terms of thinking of the regulatory science and approval and labeling and thinking about commercial models that I think is going to really help the sector. CAR therapies are a cell therapy and a gene therapy by definition. You apply both components. And I think this will allow, the sector to really think about standards, specifications, quality by design, and how you make these products available and ultimately affordable and available, right? As we talked this morning about the high cost of goods in gene therapies and cell therapies as a whole. So I'm feeling cautiously optimistic. In fact, I'm quite optimistic that I think from a regulatory pathway, we're going to see some good things happen in the next 18, 24 months, maybe even sooner. Let's hope and see. I think you'll start to see much more global awareness of what's going on. I'm looking forward to seeing how Europe and Japan expand as well in this area. So I'm thinking we're well on that curve up now, and this is a typical cycle as we experience in all markets, but you have to make your own opportunities in this kind of market.
And listen, I heard you this morning when we were discussing the fact that autologous and hematological will be the initial beachheads. And as we have real successful products that have, and what's a little bit strange about gene therapy is this is one of those cases where N equaled 1. Where with one patient, it seemed like we had definitive proof of concept. Every CEO and every company that we follow said, wait, we don't know everything. This is really early, but the market didn't wait. Valuations shot up. And then when it turned out that maybe we don't know exactly the dosing, we don't know what the patient variability is, the stocks have crashed. But I think you see what I see, which is there certainly are signals there.
For
and
sure.
now over the next 12 to 18 months or sometime in 2017, we may actually see this commercialized. And as it's commercialized, I think you do see kind of the takeoff again on this curve. So I agree with you. I think it is a very interesting point, and I think you have to be a little future thinking, and certainly in a role where you're an R&D, you're partnering, you can't afford to get trapped by what the market is saying. You almost don't care what the market is saying because you see the inevitability. Dr. Cheng, help me understand where you are today with Sanofi. Now that, I've never really thought of Sanofi as kind of on the leading edge in gene therapy. Are they?
Of course they are. I mean, you may not know, they actually had an investment in Oxford for a couple of ocular diseases that's now actually part of our program. So look, I mean, the reason why there's so much excitement is because there's a reason. And the reason is what we heard this morning. There's obviously promising and encouraging data from a variety of different areas. So we talked about Glybera this morning, and coming along the lines on the charts that was shown by Maury this morning, we talked about LCA1 for the inherited disease of blindness. We talked about hemophilia. So there are a lot of good data coming through in the clinic that's actually generating this excitement that we're seeing today. I think over the last several years, we've also had the benefit of a significant revolution in our understanding of the merits and challenges of gene therapy. So we today find ourselves looking at the suite of vectors that were developed 10 years ago. And we now have a very good understanding of their capabilities. So we're applying it as quickly as we can to the diseases that meet that criteria, which is basically the low-hanging fruit. And I think that's really where the excitement is. So there's a bunch of diseases that we think could merit from this technology as we stand today. But the exciting part is that there are new vectors that are continuing to be built and to be developed as we speak. And that would be used for other diseases. So today at Sanofi Genzyme, we're focusing on inherited CNS and ocular diseases because those are localized diseases that we believe that we can manage and provide a benefit today. And we're going to do this not only by ourselves, but through partnerships, as I mentioned earlier. So you know about our relationship with Voyager that you heard about this morning, Therapeutics with Steve Paul, where we are collaborating and pooling our resources and knowledge and technologies and manufacturing capacity to hopefully advance some of these for the inherited neurodegenerative diseases. So going forward, I think we're really excited about the potential of where we should take this. Do we take this to the hepatic diseases that we begin to see some good signs of success? Or do we be bold and take it beyond that to look at the muscle diseases as well as the kidney diseases? So initially, I think we're going to be focusing on the CNS and ocular, for which we have some really nice, interesting programs that we're working on today. But going forward, I think we are very excited about what else the technology can bring to us.
Can you share with me, what's the process if I'm a CEO of a microcap company and I think I have an interesting target, I'm starving for capital and funding, how do I get to you? How do I get to a Sanofi Genzyme, or how do I get to a Novartis to tell my story?
I think you heard it from different speakers today. It starts with good science. If you have a concept and you have data that says that you have a package that has a very good technical probability of technical success associated with that concept or asset, we are all ears. So we're not looking for the largest commercial market. We're really looking for assets that we can translate, has a very good probability of success in the clinic. Because we all appreciate that this is still a relatively new field, and we really need to start with a base with success. And we begin to see some of that, but I don't think we have enough. So we are willing to invest, even in the very smaller commercial space.
So when I show up at your door and I open up my folder, what's the checklist of items that I better have in hand? Manufacturing, proof of concept, animal data. At what point can we have a discussion?
I would say definitely, for me, it's a good preclinical proof of concept. That's all we're looking for. And that the idea really has merit, that the biology, the disease that you're working on is really well understood, and that there's a rationale and a path going forward. Manufacturing, I don't think we expect that to be in place.
Gotcha.
Because we can help perhaps provide some of that.
Similar?
So if it's a pre-POC asset, preclinical, it should be de-risked as much as possible. Animal data helps, but showing a clear pathway to get to human studies is a must. Mm-hmm. I already mentioned IP. I already mentioned the ability to think about how you would take this to a GMP grade setting is also key. And as I say, the credibility of the team, these are the things that I certainly look at. If it's post-POC, then clearly the data trumps everything, right? How compelling is that data? Will this data be reproducible? Can it be translated to multi-center settings? Is this something that can really be applied globally? Those are the things that I would look at from a more mature asset perspective. So I hope I gave you some flavor.
Good. And so now to change gears, because it's not just all about gene therapy. I believe, by the way, that on the awareness curve, we may see some amazing data coming from regenerative medicine. Athersys is presenting here. They're going to talk about multi-stem and stroke. Mesoblast presented earlier. We're going to see some interim analysis in congestive heart failure partnered with Teva. Those are major blockbuster indications. Maybe the only indication I could think of that would equal that would be diabetes. But I've been hearing about cell transplants, scaffolds, and islet cells. So, Mark, you strike me as a relatively conservative guy. How did this happen?
I didn't know I was conservative, but how did this happen as far as the deal that we did?
What motivated you to really make the move and kind of drive a venture that's going to be looking at, help me understand, first of all, you're transplanting?
Yeah, so we're developing we're taking embryonic stem cells, we differentiate those cells to a certain state. ViaCyte pioneered the work of pancreatic precursors, where it takes about 3 months for the cells. You transplant them, within about 3 months you get insulin. And they showed proof of concept, and now they're in the clinic where they've done over a dozen patients. In our case, we're tracking along that path, but we were able to develop protocols that could take the cells even to a more mature state where they would make insulin. So rather than waiting 3 months, you could get the same amount of insulin in 2 or 3 weeks. So the cells were much closer to an islet-like structure. But that said,
Those are allogeneic.
these are allogeneic.
Yes, gotcha.
Yeah, we've always been married to an allogeneic strategy. And again, we're looking at type 1 diabetes, which is autoimmune. So that's another, complexity of the product. But in any event, the real issue for us came down to, it took us longer to make we really came upon these differentiation protocols over the last year or so. So when we looked out over the timeline, it's still several years from the clinic. And here we had ViaCyte, where we have an equity investment already, and they're in the clinic with call it a first generation technology. And we just felt that combining those different assets, that you now had a first generation where you actually had human clinical data, we were bringing in another technology and more differentiated cells that could potentially be a second generation technology. And plus all of this, there was a lot of IP that covered various methods as well as composition of matter. If we melded the two, we'd have a much stronger entity and increase the probability of success. So the one thing I would add to your curve, though, I would share Usman's perspective on cell therapy. I think we're kind of in the bumpy period and coming out, because I think the one thing that's going on that's really not always obvious, but it's behind the scenes, is the heavy lifting is really around process development and manufacturing. Taking it from the bench and actually making it GMP. It's not the most exciting and sexy science. It's not the Nature biotech covers and science publications. But that's where the rubber meets the road in making a product. And the one thing in this field, and I think we can speak for all of the big pharmas in many respects, over the last 10 years, the institutional knowledge has significantly increased. I mean, now you have hundreds of people that are involved. You have regulatory, clinical, quality. All of these folks now actually understand that a cell therapy means the cells get transplanted. They're just not making a protein in a bioreactor. That sounds very simplistic, but that was a hard road to kind of to climb. I would say mountain to climb. And there's a lot of that institutional knowledge now that I think positions us to hopefully keep on the positive side of this.
Listen, I agree with you completely, and I think this morning it was an epiphany when I heard the use of the word that this is really another paradigm shift.
Absolutely.
We went from small molecules to large molecules to biologics and monoclonal antibodies, but this is another paradigm shift.
Mm-hmm.
It's something different in terms of how it's delivered, how it's transported, and it hit me like a ton of bricks that you could put all of this effort into making the product only to have it not infused properly and not work.
We have to actually make separate organizations to make it work.
Yeah.
Right, there's a good example, Novartis and Sanofi had
I agree. I think that's greatly underappreciated by the market, and I think if you're smart, you can use that as a leading indicator of kind of where the industry is. But quite honestly, when I think of the large-scale commercial manufacturers, I see Lonza out there for many companies, PCT in the clinical stage. But is it, when we get to these large manufacturing hurdles, that's something that's going to get tackled internally at a Novartis or at a Sanofi or at a J&J, right?
Well, but we partner all the time. We partner with other large pharmas in manufacturing often. We also use some of the same CMOs, contract manufacturing organizations. So we do farm out a lot of our manufacturing. So, I think a lot of the process development, it makes a lot of sense to take your early research and do a lot of process. It's still science in many respects, the process science and development. But once you have your batch records and your SOPs and you've actually done that internally, and then you can take that outside, it really offers up an opportunity to partner with different groups.
Jason, I would say it'd be very arrogant for any of us to be on this stage and say one company is going to solve this, because they're not going to do it.
Correct.
We have, from the Novartis perspective, have visible partnerships in the manufacturing space, both when we look at lentiviral technology, when we look at activation of the T cells, when we look at some of the automation aspects that we're working on. These are skill sets that we are building, but there are partners we're using, and in this world we will continue to do that. I think the advantages that large organizations bring is obviously the thinking about scale and globalization and supply chain and all these other aspects that frankly we're good at doing because of our heritage and where we've been as large organizations. But in terms of the core science around manufacturing and scalability, that's not something one company is going to crack alone. That's why you have so many players in this space now, in this ecosystem, that are going to be symbiotic and build value together. And that's a part of our business that we look at very, very carefully. It's a different way for pharma to think about owning everything versus having strategic partnerships in place for the right areas, but maintaining control over the overall value system.
Right. Well, we're going to go back and, in business school, probably soon, be reading about Provenge, right? And about the lessons of Provenge. Yeah. And I think we're going to, probably be looking to avoid some of those lessons. Provenge really was a pioneer, but it was undone by manufacturing, essentially. So with that, Jeff, let's talk a little bit about Opexa, because if we ever want to talk about complex manufacturing, T-Selenia, it's an amazing technology. It is personalized, it is autologous. Help me understand, my God, what are you going to do if the data is good?
Yeah, we'll be moving very quickly. It's really a matter of pulling the trigger when we see the data, right? And it's refining that manufacturing process, really understanding it, and how we can distribute it globally. I mean, this is an autologous therapy, so it needs to be. We assume we're going to need a centralized manufacturing plant in both the U.S., Europe. Look to other countries later. And really bring in the processes, tech transfer. But I think this kind of goes back to what are we looking for in these partners. We want to make sure our partners really understand that they have a process that can be scalable. And I think that was the critical flaw with Provenge. Can you scale it up massively? And we need to engage our partners early on, for example, Opexa, and ensure that we have a system that can be scaled out. It's one thing to do it in a clinic, in a phase 1 trial, an investigator-sponsored trial where you've got the clean room, you can make your cells, and, for example, CAR T cells, and administer them to the patient. But imagine the logistics involved when you're treating thousands of patients, chain of custody, actually running the experiments, ensuring that you've got all the reagents manufactured and sourced. It's a huge ball of wax, and that can't be understated enough. Thinking about your process early, especially in the case of Opexa, T-Selena, and in the case of CAR T cells, you can't be thinking about it early enough. You really need to have that roadmap ahead of you.
I mean, Opexa in particular strikes me as an enigma, right? Because I've looked at the data, I've seen there seems to be a really good signal. I'm excited. I hope that they can get the data. I worry a little bit about the endpoints. Yeah. Brain atrophy is a little bit kind of unusual, but maybe it will work, in that particular form of MS. But what I also see is a $15 million market cap. It's a tiny market cap. I can tell you as an analyst, for me to try to get a meeting with institutions, it's very, very difficult. Clearly on the awareness curve, no one believes. So I guess what I'm asking you is, if the data is good, if the data is compelling to you, is Sanofi prepared to really move forward with Opexa? So I'm sorry.
I hope they don't.
Sorry, Merck Serono. Yeah, there you go. Sure. You're ready to go. So no, yeah, but sorry, my mistake. But are you prepared to move forward? And
I can say honestly, we're not fully prepared.
Right.
We know what would be ahead of us, and we know the amount of work that we would need to do to put that in place. I think it really comes back to looking at the cost of producing this and the logistics of making this work. I mean, we have to have a discussion about the cost of manufacturing, the personalized therapy that this is. This will not become an allogeneic therapy. I mean, for CAR T, we want to make an off-the-shelf product. This will never be that.
Right.
But patients in secondary progressive MS, they have no other options right now. So, I mean, it's really balancing this, and it becomes more of an internal discussion. What do we want to do with this? Can we make it affordable? Can we really break it out and distribute it across different markets? Can we make this work? I mean, it's really a discussion that we're going to have once we see those data. And the data really will tell us what's the patient population we could address, what's the current pipeline, the competitive pipeline, and then decide where to invest that money.
Well, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but as an analyst that covers Opexa, it strikes me that this was a call option for you in partnering. And it's just, if the data, it seems to me that you're looking for really good data, and if the data is really compelling, I'm trying to understand how prepared you really are. And what I hear you saying is, yeah, it's on your radar screen, but you're not ready to just pull the trigger.
Not immediately. I mean, we're looking at a 6-month ramp up. I mean, we have a plan. if this all works out, we absolutely have a plan. So but it is a ramp-up period where we don't want to invest too soon in this opportunity, but we also want to be prepared logistically. So when we pull that trigger, we can move very quickly.
Okay, so I mean, manufacturing is going to become a sticky issue, right? You know, it's one thing to have proof of concept in a phase 1 clinical trial. It's another thing to apply for commercial approval. And what I hear you saying is, look, let's get into a phase 3 trial. During that phase 3 trial, we make the go decision, and then we really start to put a team on to work out the manufacturing.
For this case, yeah, for this case.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I want to change the topic a little bit now, and I want to understand, what does your parent or what is your boss, right? Now, I'm not sure who that would be, but you know, we all report into somebody. What does your boss want to hear from you so that they know that you're spending your money wisely? You know, how much pressures are on you to perform and to show that you're producing products? So why don't we start at the end? Oz, tell me, you know, do you feel pressure?
None whatsoever, no. My boss is David Epstein, who's the division head of pharma. He is a big visionary guy. He sees where the world is going, and he was the big champion and advocate, together with Joe Jimenez, our corporate CEO, to create our business. So there is no lack of vision in terms of where we think the world can move to with cell and gene therapies. In terms of what they're looking for from deliverables, yeah, I'm held to very high milestone attainment. You know, I have to show progress in programs, clearly. Every milestone is a very big milestone in this space, particularly in terms of regulatory interaction, milestones in the numbers of patients we manufacture. We're very privileged that we have our own internal Novartis facility for cell processing for the CAR-T therapies, where we are now currently manufacturing and treating patients in Europe, in the US, in Canada, in Japan, and in Australia. And so we've demonstrated the ability that we were able to bring a product from an academic lab setting, from Bruce Levine's lab at Penn, technically transfer that, show comparability, and now have demonstrated that that product works as well as the product at Penn, because we know the data that will be disclosed later in the year at appropriate scientific forums. So very specific milestones in the programs. We're also held to a high regard in terms of the competitive environment, what our competitors are doing. Clearly, I'm working in a field where my competition is very capable. My colleagues at Juno, Kite, Bluebird, other companies in the CAR-T space know what they're doing here, and they're moving fast. They're well-capitalized companies, so I spend a significant amount of time ensuring that runway, even in a big organization. We all have resource constraints, dollar constraints. We are competing for share of voice and dollars from our board of directors and the allocators of funding, the same way as any public company or small biotech is doing with their investors. And so milestones critically matter. We are looked at very closely, and also we are tasked with being realistic about the future as well. We never claim this is going to be the panacea for all tumor types, for example, when you look at immuno-oncology. But we do believe that in hematological malignancies, as a start, this could be pretty transformative. When you look at the data from pediatric cancers and lymphoblastic leukemia, you look at lymphoma, and you start to look at conditions like multiple myeloma, those are still sizable unmet need populations and potential opportunities. We have some way to go when it comes to solid tumors and some of the discussions that we had earlier. So we're both realists, and at the same time, we are held to a pretty high standard, I think, in terms of what we have to deliver as an organization.
Dr. Cheng?
Success. So we have to deliver. So in the context of in vivo gene therapy, we have yet to get a product to the finish line. So the onus is for us to get one there as quickly as we can. I'm actually in a very good position in that the company is highly interested and committed to investing in this space, as illustrated by investments in Voyager and before that in Alnylam, which is a different technology, which is RNAi, which is also doing very well. So the onus is on us is to advance these programs as efficiently as possible to the end point. And if we do that, we're also in the midst of thinking about, well, how do we support it? Can we start building the infrastructure in terms of manufacturing? So capacity, as we talked about, is relatively limiting. And if we do invest in building our own manufacturing capacity for viral vectors, we obviously need to think about how are we going to continue to feed that infrastructure. And so again, part of that illness is to say, if we believe in our success in the foreseeable future, how do we begin to build that pipeline to maintain and make this part of a much larger business at Sanofi that we have today?
Thank you. Mark?
So I have a couple different bosses, probably like everybody on the panel, but mine are distinct. One's internal and one's external. So in the capacity of working for ViaCyte, I'll report into the CEO, Paul Lakin. And my role there will be strategy and business development, but a big part of that, over the last 10 years, we have a lot of relationships that we've developed, both research-wise, business-wise, and a lot of those have to be now shepherded into ViaCyte. So in the short term, that's an important goal for me. And then I now report to the global head of innovation within J&J. So that's going to be my boss, and I have to make sure my bosses are connected. But at the end of the day, I think the intent is to do everything to make ViaCyte wildly successful and facilitate clinical success and ultimately commercial success.
Interesting. Jeff?
Yeah, we're in it for the long play, really. I mean, certainly there are near-term goals and deliverables. It's funny, I had the hype curve on the pitch slide for Intrexon. I said, we're for CAR T, we're at that hype phase where there's a lot of noise, a lot of interest, a lot of investment here. But we need to think about this long term, harkening back to Gleevec, that sparked a tremendous amount of investment, things fell through, and then they picked up again. So, near term, there certainly are critical deliverables with our partner, and we need to demonstrate that we're moving forward with a product that can stand on its own.
So help me understand, let this, we have 3 minutes left. Let's kind of focus on closing remarks. So, give me your closing comments and help me understand what one thing when you're thinking about the next event that you have your fingers crossed, what's that event? What is that for you, Oz?
For me, it's about getting a successful filing, but beyond that, an approval with a label that is then translating to a basis for a proof of concept for a viable commercial model.
Yeah,
that's what
it's
I'm
justification
really
for everything you're doing.
Everything else, yeah.
You would agree?
I would totally agree. And I would, in my case, look to the forthcoming data from the LCA1 trial that's coming out from Spark.
And what's that gonna? What's the target there? What's that? What's the therapeutic indication for that?
It's a disease of childhood blindness.
Okay, good.
Which is a local delivery of a viral vector. And I think if that proves to be a success in the clinic, as we believe that it could.
Transformative.
Transformative. I mean, blind and sight. I mean, how dramatic.
Doesn't get any better than that, right?
Right. So I think if we get that, I think it will form the basis of the discussion that Oz just mentioned.
Very exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we all have key milestones, right? So I think the key milestone for us in this transition is to facilitate a successful tech transfer, but do everything we can to facilitate a successful proof of concept in humans.
Right. You mentioned that ViaCyte's in the clinic, so they're actually transplanting patients now.
That's right. We didn't talk about devices at all in the course of this. That's a whole
Right.
other conversation. But it is a combo product. It's cells inside of a device, and it's a safety trial right now. And the next steps are going to be basically dosing, assuming moving forward. With respect to everything looks good so far. The next step is going to be showing proof of concept with respect to dosing and proof of concept.
Well, we should talk next week. I want to talk to you more. And I think for you, I have some idea what the data is. When are you looking for data from OPEXA?
Yeah, third quarter.
Yeah. So this is a big event. This is really going to be either it moves forward or let's move to the next
Very
thing.
likely, yeah. And then for CAR T, I mean, we're watching the space. We're watching registration. We expect to see that. But equally important is on the regulatory front. Hearing about FDA putting together a safety database for CAR T, that's really encouraging. That'll help us move forward as well.
Thanks so much, guys. I mean, it's an interesting panel, right? You really are the leaders in what you're doing in the industry. And it's hard because I can tell you as an analyst and as investors, rarely do we get access to someone at this level who's controlling kind of the R&D and the budgets and the business and the licensing opportunities. But what I hear you saying is that this technology, the cell therapy space, kind of it's not being ignored by pharma. Pharma is investing. They're kind of building their positions, and we're really just waiting for proof of concept in the evolution of the therapies. Is that fair?
It is fair.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.